everyone, it's Lauren again from arc.dev, a platform that makes your jump to remote easier by simplifying your job search. We connect software developers everywhere with great remote opportunities. And today I'm very pleased to present to you Alastair Simpson, VP of Design at Dropbox. And Alastair, since we are in an event about job seeking, I'd like to kick us off, as we are with each interview, with that very challenging yet simple job interview question. So can you tell me about yourself? You can give us an example of your own 30-second elevator pitch, but I know you have much more to say. So just before it, dive right in.
I will. I'll try and keep it short, but thank you everyone for joining, and thank you arc.dev for hosting me. It's great to be here. I can give before I'm the VP of Design, I'm a father of 2 young kids. You can see my daughter's artwork here. She's 6 and my son is 3. I'm a former semi-professional soccer player, now retired, and then by day the VP of Design at Dropbox. I'll just talk really briefly. It won't be 30 seconds, but it's not going to be too long, about where I started, because I do not have a linear design career at all. That's the main theme. There was nothing linear about it. And I didn't study design in college or university as it was in England where I studied. I studied business studies with sports science, can you believe? And then at the end of college, I applied for grad jobs and got turned down by them all, and then did something. I said yes to going traveling. So I went traveling around the world in Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and I then ended up living in Australia for a year. And the only job I could get was really in a call center. So I actually started my design career in a call center. But the reason I tell that story that way, telling you about myself, is that call center was really pivotal. Because if anybody's ever worked in a call center where you have to listen to somebody who's phoned in, who may be irate, you have to talk to them and ask them questions and understand their problems before trying to give them a solution. It's incredibly hard. And that has really stood me in good stead in my design career, because I fundamentally believe that design is really 90% communication and the remaining 10% is actual design work. And so that gave me a really good grounding that has stood me in great stead for my entire career. You know, as I mentioned, things like actively listening to people, asking questions to uncover needs, understanding problems before you build anything or try and sell something to someone. So I think those are fundamental skills of designers. And so that's why I always like to say that I started my design career in a call center, and then later found my way to becoming a designer and had a little bit more of a typical design journey from there. Became a design team of 1, built my own usability testing lab as a design team of 1, started working with cross-discipline teams in engineering and product, did visual design, interaction design, branding, made loads of mistakes, but was making and doing. And then, went on to work in an agency as head of design, then into Atlassian, where I was head of design for about 6 years. And now at Dropbox as the VP of Design, where I manage brand, product design, research, ops, and UX writing. So that's kind of my journey. And I've learned a lot through various aspects of that, which I know we'll probably talk about.
So when did you first decide that you wanted to work remotely? I think your first remote job at Atlassian.
Kind of, yes, that's the first proper remote job, but I was probably doing remote without realizing it at the agency that I worked at. We were on terrible WebEx conference calls where you could only hear people. So you had 30 people in 4 different locations in 3 different meeting rooms. And so that's technically remote. That's a distributed team. But then really at Atlassian, there was a lot of mistakes made there that I definitely learned from. But then really at Atlassian, I got my first remote team. I had a design team in Sydney, in Australia. And then I got a team in Vietnam, in Saigon, in Vietnam. And that was my first experience of having a distributed team or a remote team. And honestly, I had the massive kind of, the moment many people go through where they realize that having a team that's not in the same location, you cannot just transfer the things that you do in person to having the team in a different location. I was very big on in-person Monday morning coffee meets design, where we would sit around as 10 designers, drink coffee, talk about design. In-person design crit, stand at a wall, put pictures up and like talk about the design and the flow. And so I went through this learning curve of not being very good, to be honest, at remote work and managing that team in Saigon. And again, I learned a lot. And I eventually, my team at Atlassian was about 70 or 80 designers spread literally across the world. Sydney, in multiple offices, Mountain View, San Francisco, remote in North America, Trello, were a fully remote team. In India as well. Just before I left, I had a team in India. And so I had this fully distributed group who were some in home office and some in offices. And so it forces you to, the main thing I think about remote is it forces you to be really intentional about the practices that you employ and how you manage people. Because leading a team remotely, every interaction that you have with them is an opportunity to show that you care about them, that you want to be inclusive. And so if you're really intentional with that, you can achieve that. And so coming to Dropbox, I actually started at Dropbox on March 24th, which for most people, they'll realize that that was post-lockdown here in America. And so I've never been into the Dropbox office as an employee. And so I've never met many of my direct reports. I've never met many of my cross-discipline partners. And so it's forced me in Dropbox I've worked in a fully remote setting. And so you could argue, you asked, why did you pursue that remote career? It's almost chosen me through Atlassian and then my move into Dropbox. And now with, you may, I think we'll touch on it later, but Dropbox has announced a shift to virtual first, what we're calling virtual first, which means instead of being in offices, our primary mode of communication will be working from home remotely, but we will have Dropbox studios, which are where our offices were, where we'll get teams to come together once a month or once a quarter to collaborate together, because we want to make the best of both worlds of working remotely, but also understanding that you need to come together for these magical moments where you need to collaborate in person. And that's certainly what we're trying to kind of do at Dropbox, both with our products and with how we're building those products and services internally.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Anyone who hasn't read about this, you should Google it, check it out, and see. I've read some about what you're doing to your offices, how you're completely transforming those. But this is actually the interesting part of why you're here today, is that you're actually the one who's kind of the driving force behind this movement, since you're the one with that remote experience. How did you end up in that role? I mean, skip forward to this bit and we'll get to,
No, of course. No, I mean, I fundamentally believe that as a design leader, I think it's important that design has an impact at the company level, right? So it's not just about the pixels anymore for design. That is obviously important, don't get me wrong. That is our day job. That is the core of what we should be doing. But I fundamentally believe that design needs to have an impact at the company level in things like organizational design, in how our company is set up, in how we help facilitate working together as cross-disciplinary partners. Because I think that is taking a human-centered approach to redesigning the way that we work. Like we already touched on a little bit that the way that we worked in offices was in many ways broken, in my opinion. It was actually broken. But if we just transition that to online and say, oh, we now have Zoom, that's a meeting, that doesn't necessarily work. You need to really think about how you're working together as teams. We're all humans, and humans are messy, right? Like we're messy individuals, and it's about how do you build relationships? How do you build trust? How do you make sure your meetings are inclusive? And I talk a lot about practices versus process. And so many of those practices are grounded in my opinion, in design thinking and facilitating and gaining an understanding of the shared problem that you're working on together as a group, and understanding where you're not aligned on that problem. And so that's really how I ended up leading part of the virtual first movement at Dropbox, because I've been talking a lot internally about that, about how design should really have an impact at that company level and about how we build products and services. And then when we announced this shift, I was the accountable owner for creating a set of those flexible practices around how we build products and services. And so you can see the first version of that. Anyone can go and get that for free if you just Google Dropbox Virtual First Toolkit. There's the first version is live online, and it contains a lot of practical recommendations for how to work thoughtfully in a remote environment. And not just about work, but about your personal life, because too often, if you're working remotely, your work life can just bleed into your personal life, and that's a net negative. Whereas we want to make sure that we're looking after people from the work point of view, but also in their personal lives, and we're allowing them that downtime. And so there's a few small things that we've done there. We have things called core collaboration hours, where we expect people to be online between 9 and 1 in their local time zone. But then outside of that, we expect people to just get to the right outcome. We don't expect that's the main thing. And then they can design their own non-linear workday around that. And so for me, what that means is on a Friday, I will finish at 3 and I'll go and pick my kids up, right? And I can do that and have that flexibility, but then I will catch up on work at a time that's more convenient for me. And so there's some of the different ways that I think we're approaching it, and how I ended up like driving some of this virtual first transition. And I think, just to end on a small analogy, it's if you think about a company, right, what it's trying to do, company is launching products, so let's say that they're ships, right? So you're launching ships or boats out into the world. At scale, what I believe that we need to do as design leaders, but also as senior leaders, is we need to build a better shipyard, right? Not just lean into the individual ship or the individual boat. We actually need to build a better shipyard or a better system so that we can have a sustained impact at the company level. And so that's really what I'm certainly trying to do as a design leader at Dropbox, and how I ended up leading some of the virtual first work here.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind me asking, I'm very curious, like, how does a big change like this come about in a company like Dropbox? Like, did someone just pop up in a meeting one day and say, hey, what if we did this? Like, how was this change sparked, and when did you start thinking about this as a team overall?
Yeah, the change, it's, as with any big decision like this, it's a multifaceted decision. There's lots of things that go into it, right? And it's looking at, if you think about strategy as how you look at the competitive landscape, right? It's the competitive landscape is many more people are expecting flexibility in how they work, right? And so we needed to look into that. We obviously surveyed employees as well about their sentiment around these things, and then looked at our own mission. Our mission is to design an enlightened way of working. And then our company values around making work human, for example, as one value. And once we took in lots of those different inputs, we realized that, with the change in the landscape, there's a massive transformation of our company and culture, and also of the work landscape in general, right? And so we want to be at the forefront of those new ways of working, to design that enlightened way of working. And so for us, based on a number of those principles and our values and our mission, it made a lot of sense to move into this virtual first way of working. But as I said, retaining those in-person magical moments that we know teams need via the Dropbox studios that we'll have, right? And so again, the net for us, we hope that obviously this will allow us to attract and retain talent from more locations and build a more diverse workforce that reflects the diversity of our customer base. And so that's kind of how it comes together. But as I said, going back to my first point, it's a multifaceted decision. It's a hard decision. We took lots of qualitative and quantitative data, and we took time over it, because it's the type of decision that's, I talk about one-way and two-way door decisions. The two-way door decision is something you can go into and come back out of quite easily. A one-way door decision is something that once you're in, you're in. So it's a decision that we took a lot of time on, and we got lots of input so that we could make a really thoughtful decision about the future of Dropbox, and that's where we landed.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear that you're making this transition, and I'm sure our audience is as well, as many of them may be hoping to work remotely for Dropbox in the future. Mm-hmm. And so let's dive into, by the way, I think I forgot to mention at the beginning that we will be taking audience questions, so you can feel free to drop them in the chat, the stage chat, at any time, and we'll address them during the last 15 minutes of our hour-long segment. But diving into something that I'm sure many of you are wondering, as you're making these changes at Dropbox, how are they affecting the company's hiring process moving forward? Like, as you consider hiring new employees, are you restricting it based on location? And moving forward from that, what kind of things are you looking for when you're hiring now?
At a broad level, we're looking for people that have a growth mindset, and they want to learn and adapt, with the company and with the products that we're building, because they will change over the course of the future. And so that's at a broad level. We also, for discipline-specific roles, we have clear career frameworks and rubrics around these are the pillars that we have around, say, leadership or impact, and these are the different competencies that we have around those. But the hiring process, we're still working through exactly how it will change. But as I talked about in the prior question, it's a huge transformation of our company and our culture. And certainly we want to live up to that mission to design an enlightened way of working. And so we hope this change, though, because we will be opening up to more locations across North America, mainly in 2021, that we, as I said, will be able to attract talent that we previously were not able to attract. And we'll also be able to retain existing Dropboxers who want more flexibility in the way that they work and where they work. And so we hope that flexibility creates a more diverse Dropbox employee base that, as I said, will reflect that customer base. And so thinking about hiring people that want to work, as I said, in that growth mindset, with a flexible mindset of how they want to work and operate, and they're comfortable in doing that, right? Because it is harder, right? If you think for over 100 years, we've been conditioned that it's 9 to 5, right? From old schools, like that's how schools were run, that's how factories were run. What we're offering is more flexibility around making your work schedule work for you, right? As I mentioned, I go and pick my kids up on Fridays at 3. I drop them off at school 2 days a week. I'm able to do that because of the flexibility that Dropbox provides me in being online and those core collaboration hours, but having the flexibility to get to the right outcome in a schedule that works for me.
Yeah, so I guess before you made this transition, were you all on a strict 9 to 5 kind of schedule? I guess you kind of started off once the pandemic had already made everything change. So how flexible was it before? Just out of curiosity.
Again, generally team specific, but most people were in an office in San Francisco or Seattle or New York or Austin or Tel Aviv or Dublin, our main centers. But most people would be 9 to 5, but then there would be teams that would work cross regions. And so you'd have some level of flexibility around that. But then it would be, well, what we're trying to do now with the changes around core collaboration hours is just be much more deliberate about how we're setting teams up to operate and giving teams very clear guidelines around when we expect people to be online for synchronous working versus asynchronous working. Because again, that's an important delineation, I think, in remote work is when should you have a synchronous conversation as a meeting on Zoom versus when can you move to asynchronous, something like Dropbox Paper or Slack, like where you can actually put something down in writing and then wait for a response. And so we're just trying to be a lot more deliberate around how we do those things in this new kind of setup.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's extremely important to success. There can be a learning curve in figuring out what works best for each team, but it sounds like you're doing great. Let's talk a little more about hiring remote workers now. So if you're hiring someone, you've never seen them before, and they'll be in this environment that you've created with asynchronous communication and everything, what are like 3 key soft skills that you look for in a candidate?
I alluded to this in my intro of myself. For me, the number one thing, not just in design, in many disciplines, though, but definitely in design, is communication, right? I've written an article on Medium about it's the number one skill that designers overlook, because I think it genuinely is. I've seen really amazing work presented and communicated really not in a great way, and I feel bad because the work is excellent. It doesn't mean, though, that you can communicate your way out of bad work, and I think that's true, but understanding your audience, understanding when to listen, understanding how to present your argument in a logical manner, understanding the power of verbal communication like we're doing now versus the power of switching to written communication and writing an argument very succinctly, which outlines the problem from the customer's point of view, from the business point of view, what the goal is, how your proposed solution solves that. That is an art, I think, in and of itself. And I think so it's one of the most important soft skills, I think, even in co-located in an office setup, but in a remote job, I think it's even more important because it's your primary way of communicating is either on Zoom, where you can miss some of the in-person, like physical cues that you get because you're not in person, or if you're communicating via Slack, or if you're communicating via something like a Dropbox paper document. And just to highlight that point, it's, I give this analogy where if we were in the same office and we'd worked together for a number of years, and I came up to your desk and said, "Hey, Lauren, why did you make that decision?" Right? That's perfectly benign because we've known each other. That's a simple question. You can see me. You can see I'm not angry. I'm just asking a question. If I use the same words, but I communicate that in Slack or Jira or Dropbox paper, and the other person is in a different time zone and they wake up to that and they've got 99 other notifications, those same words, why did you make that decision, can come across as a threat, right? And so understanding that the different communication method and medium may mean you need to change how you ask that question and give more context. Hey, Lauren, I'm just looking at this thing. I know that you're working on it for a long time, and I'm really looking for more background on why you made this decision. That comes across as more benign, but many people don't appreciate that difference. And so I think communication skills would be the number one. I can probably, if I had to just pick one, that would be the one. Mm-hmm. The next is around, like working really well in a team. Again, I mentioned that we're all humans, and you can see my daughter's artwork. You can, I'm a father. I, have all the normal human traits and problems going on in the pandemic world and dealing with young children and all the things. But understanding those nuances and being a human backed in order to enable effective teamwork, because that's what we're all trying to do, like enable effective teamwork. So I think that would be the next soft skill around, beefing up your emotional intelligence and how you interact with different people, and how you enable strong teamwork and contribute to a strong team would be the second one. And then the last one would be around kind of, again, I've mentioned it, but kind of this growth mindset or flexibility. Because I think, even in my career, I've been working for almost 20 years, but, when I actually, not long before I started work, I didn't grow up with mobile phones, right? I only got a mobile phone when I was like 17 or 18, and they weren't even a thing. It's not how you know it today. And when I had my first job, we had phones on our desks and we used to phone each other, right? And email was this new thing, really. But there's been so much change, and I think there's only going to be more change. There's the term VUCA around volatility, uncertainty, the different types of ambiguity that we have in our world today, that I think you need a growth mindset or flexibility in order to adapt to those changes, because things will change. Technology will change, tools will change, how we interact with people will change. Lots of different things will continue to change, and you need to have that mindset in order to grow with that and adapt with it. And I think that's, that flexibility is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think if anything, this year has been an example of how suddenly things can change and how you have to adapt to get your work done as well as you can, no matter what the situation. So
that's exactly right.
Equality. So when you're interviewing people at Dropbox, or if someone's expecting their interview at Dropbox soon, what kind of questions can they expect, and how should they answer those questions? Do you have any favorite interview questions that you'd like to share with us?
You certainly what we're looking for is behavioral questions, right? Like one of my favorite questions is very open-ended. It's, tell me about your favorite project that you worked on. But then I add a little bit more about set up the context, who was on the project team, what was your role, but then talk to me through specifically what did you contribute to that project, and what was the end outcome? Did it succeed or did it fail? And certainly for me, it's around understanding in those moments, does the person show humility, and did the project end successfully? Do they show humility in terms of how the positives that they brought to the project, and how they adapted to different changes in that project? And then how they talk about their teammates, because again, no project happens with one person today. Very, very rarely, right? Unless you're literally a freelancer working by yourself or a sole proprietor. So many projects in tech, they happen in that way. And so that would be like what I would be looking for, and what many people are looking for is those behavioral situational questions around, tell me about your experience. Tell me about a specific thing that you did that positively impacted this program or this project that you worked on. But as I said, be humble in your answer, right? Not every project succeeds. Like there's a stat in technology that over 50% of projects are late or do not succeed, do not meet the outcome. And so, be humble around those. But it's about, did you learn from that, and how did you change your behavior based on what you learned?
Yeah, I think like learning how to tell the story of things that you've done in the past is really important. That's a recurring theme, I think, with every speaker here, is just being able to share what you've done in a way that expresses what you've learned from it, not just there to brag about the cool thing that you did with your team.
That's right. You mentioned that, right? Like the narrative is incredibly important. I've touched on communication, right? It's what is the narrative and the story. There's a great book by Nancy Duarte around storytelling that I often recommend people read, because, no matter the discipline, because it talks about, the hero's journey on a story, and how you tell that story and that narrative, and how you combine it together. Because often the points that you think might be important are actually not important to your audience. And so you need to understand, who is your audience? How do you tell that story? Again, you asked about interview questions. It's like, who is the person that is interviewing you? Like, what is their background? Is it a panel, right? And so thinking through what is going through their minds, and how might they interpret or be interested in a part of your story, because you could change not the facts of the story, but how you craft that narrative to pull out the key points.
Yeah. So when back to interview questions, what other kinds of questions are your favorites? And if there's any way that how can you tell if someone can work well remotely in an interview? Do you have any questions for that?
Not specific. I mean, the questions are along similar lines, like situational behavioral. And again, on those project-based ones, it's like, did they share it's a small point, but did they share how they did status updates asynchronously? Because you don't need to do status updates synchronously, right? And so certainly for someone, when we're interviewing for someone that's working remotely, it's more around, how do they change their communication method and medium based on the project? And that's certainly what we're trying to tease out in those situational and behavioral questions, around how people actually show that through their experience. Because I think that's the most important thing that we're trying to, as I said, tease out in those questions. And they're, for me, honestly, you asked, how can you tell if someone can work remotely? It's, how do they interact on the initial Zoom call? Do they, seem relatively comfortable, interacting with one another? But again, it's on the interviewer to make sure that you're creating an inclusive environment for that, right? Like, are you welcoming when you get onto the Zoom call as the interviewer, right? You want to make sure that you're creating that inclusivity, and you're creating the right environment where the person being interviewed feels comfortable to share their story and their narrative, because that's, I think, incredibly important and often missed.
Yeah, I think that's really important on the side of the interviewer too, because I think it's very normal for most of us to just be overcome with nerves when you get on that camera, especially somehow virtual feels even more on the spot sometimes. So.
Yeah, and it's, both sides. It's a practice I do with my direct reports in my one-on-ones. Mm-hmm. I start every meeting with, how are you doing today? But then not just once they answer, moving on. Once they answer, asking follow-up questions, being genuinely interested, because you need to take some time to understand and learn about the other person. And also, especially if it may be a project meeting, maybe you want to kind of create that right environment, to have a good, open, honest dialogue in that session. And as I said, those are small things that you can do, in an interview setting as the interviewer, or in what team settings, to make sure that you are listening, showing that you care about the other person and the other people in the room.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people also, just speaking of the interview process, I think a lot of people are probably wondering why they never actually make it to the interview, because I'm sure, especially with the remote being here, 2020, and especially with your company announcing your shift to remote, you're probably getting a ton of applicants when you're hiring for a role. So if you're sifting through hundreds of resumes or cover letters, what stands out? Like, how can someone actually stand out?
Again, like for me, when I was interviewing at Dropbox, the key things were, I know from the recruiter side and from my side is, does this person have an affinity to the Dropbox mission? And does that come through in their CV or in how they present and show up and the questions that they ask? And so there's some things, to make sure that you're looking at when you're submitting, cover letters, CVs, etc. is like, how do you connect to what Dropbox does? And we want to design an enlightened way of working. Why is that important to you? For me, I've been fortunate to work at Atlassian and now Dropbox, which are mission and values driven companies. And whenever I'm talking to a recruiter, or whenever I was talking to a recruiter, when I was looking for a new job, that was my number one criteria. Mm-hmm. It was, I only want to go and work at a mission and values driven company, right? And so that was very important to me. And so that's something that people can make sure comes through when they're talking to recruiters, when they're shaping their CV, when they're shaping their cover letters, when they're shaping their portfolios.
Yeah, I think everyone should take notes on this, because every single speaker today has mentioned that, about making it very clear that you're aligned with the mission of the company. And I know a lot of people are sending out mass cover letters and resumes, but it's probably more worth your time to just do things slower, because you'll have a much higher chance of getting the results you want by really personalizing it to the company and showing
Totally. Like slowing down and being more intentional. Again, we talked about this intentionality when managing teams or leading teams remotely. It's the same thing when looking for a job. It's like, what are the company values? Make work human. One of our company values is they win, we win. They win being customers, right? And so how do we make sure that we're, like for me, I'm very customer centric, very customer focused. And so that aligns to the Dropbox values. And so how do you make sure that those things come through and that you're, as you said, personalizing, being intentional about the opportunities and the roles and the companies that you're going after?
Yeah. So jumping forward again, what would you say is your number one non-obvious tip for remote job seekers who want to work in design or in general for remote work? Dropbox, whatever.
I think this is, for me, this came, I was fortunate enough at Atlassian, so this is pre-Dropbox, to work with an executive coach. And, I went through this kind of framework with them, but I remember one of the first conversations I had with them, they were asking me, what do you want people to remember you for in 10 years time? And what's your career kind of aspiration? And at the time, my career aspiration was to be a design director, right? Which was a terrible thing, because I was just looking at a title. That was it, right? It wasn't. And the thing that that coach Jamie helped me realize is, they helped me figure out my own why, right? Why do I do what I do, right? And so for me, I have this professional vision to exponentially grow people, products, and teams that I work with. That's why I'm in the role that I'm in, and that's why I do what I do, because I love working with people and products and teams to kind of grow those things and make them better. And so for me, that number one non-obvious tip is, as I said, figure out your own why. Like, because then that ties back to when you're applying for roles. It's like, well, why are you applying for it? Why does this company, why do they stand out? Because the days of ping pong and office beers and things are not really, they're kind of over. You need to figure out what you want to do and what you want to work on and how you want to solve customer problems. That's ultimately how you make sure that, your own work is fulfilling and purposeful, and that you can add the maximum amount of value to the business that you're working for.
Yeah, I think that's also just key to a happy life. We spend most of our time working anyways. So if you don't have a reason for what you do, then what's the point?
That's right. That's totally right.
So now that we're in this very remote online world, both temporarily intense remote and then permanently quite remote, I'd say, how can people optimize their online presence for their remote job search? Like if you're Googling a candidate, checking out their LinkedIn, what do you like to see?
I think for me, I mentioned, I don't mind non-linear backgrounds, right? Like I think that can be a huge plus, right? I think as well does the LinkedIn profile, does it tell a strong narrative of their history and their story? And is that summarized nicely in their short bio, right? So I think it's incredibly important to make sure you're looking at that online presence and making sure it's reflecting you and yourself and that narrative that you want to come through in person. And making sure that, well, knowing that it's important that that's true to yourself, because there may be companies and recruiters that look at that and it's not what they're looking for, but that's okay, right? That is okay, because if it's not a good fit on both sides, then it's not going to be a good fit in the long term. And so that would be my, one of the main things I would look for in how to kind of think about that is like, does your LinkedIn or your social profile tell the narrative that you want to tell? Does it tell the story that you want to tell people? And is that, as I said, do you have the long history and your career history? And then do you also have the short bio that summarizes it and gives people that snapshot of who you are? And then also don't be afraid to make it personal and human, right? Like, I've talked about my kids a little bit, right? Like, we're all humans. And so it is interesting to know what people are like and what they're interested in outside of work. And I think that's, again, often missed in how people show up.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Just being your own storyteller. I'm curious now that you mentioned the nonlinear career path, just thinking about people who have maybe worked in different industries, different professions, how would you recommend that they choose what to show like on a one-page resume or their LinkedIn? Like, do they add every single thing? Because of course there's always something relevant in every job you can pull out, or how should they go about it? Do the most recent jobs? What's your...
It's honestly, it's contextual. It depends what the facts are. If the facts are that you've hopped from job to job 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, it might be slightly different than if you've gone 10 years in one career into pivoting into like the next different discipline. Because the question that's always interesting around that is how, right? You were an engineer for 10 years, and then how did you get your break in design or product management, right? Like, how did you make that switch? And, I have that, I didn't start as a designer. And so for me, I was just fortunate in that I had a CEO who knew we needed a designer, and he saw that I had the attributes for it, and he asked if I wanted to do it. And so that's always how I tell that story, is just openly and honestly, because that's how it happened. And then I took that opportunity with both hands. And so it is contextual on what exactly that pivot has been, but making sure that whatever that pivot is from discipline A to discipline B, that you have a good intellectually honest story and representation of that online. And it's clear to someone looking at it how you made that switch, right? How did you do that? And then that's backed up when you speak to that person in person.
Yeah, it sounds like that's where your bio comes into play, especially if you have a unique nonlinear career path. You can wrap it all up in your story for those viewing your profile.
Yeah.
So speaking of something that's pretty difficult to do remotely, that feels difficult to do remotely, what role can your network play in a remote job search, and how can we approach making new connections remotely? Like, for example, we have our networking feature here that's like 5-minute speed networking with people. Like, how can people approach this to make genuine connections? Do you have any recommendations for remote?
I think the key thing that you said there is genuine. Right? I think that is the cornerstone of any great network, right? Is that it's a genuine network built on trust and an equitable exchange of like information, right? And so, but I think it is always worthwhile to invest in your community and your network, right? I've learned so much from the community and mentors that I have in the community, but I've always wanted to give as well as like, not take in a negative way, but also ask questions of my network. I had a friend who is a VP of design, or he's a VP of design. He texted me literally this morning asking me a specific question about something and around design. And I immediately texted back and he's like, thanks, that's super useful intel, right? Mm-hmm. But he's helped me in the past with a number of different things, right? So it's that making genuine connections, being generous with your time with those people, but also making sure it's clear that it's, it's a two-way street, right? Like you want to learn from those people, you want to learn from your network, and you also want to give back to it, right? And so as I said, I've been fortunate that my network has opened many doors for me, but I've been inquisitive and I've been forthcoming with my own time for them. And I think that two-way exchange is incredibly important to make sure it's equitable.
Yeah, these are really great tips, especially for those of you who will pop over to networking after. Remember, just see what you can offer, even if it's just advice, experience sharing. Even if you're a beginner, everyone has something to offer.
That's right.
That's important. So final question before we jump back over to our Q&A, to take some of the audience questions that have been coming in. What should be on a remote job seeker's checklist to prepare for applying to a job? Like before they send anything to the company, what should they research? What should they know before? Like what needs to be planned in advance?
I think a lot of this is very similar to in-person interviews or in-person applications, right? But it's knowing the company, knowing their mission, their values, knowing the problems that they solve for customers and for their business, educating yourself about the products that they have, the experiments that they've done in the past, where they have locations, where they do business, and then connecting that back to how does that align with the things that are important to me and the things that are important to me in a role and in a company, because you invest a lot of time with an employer, right? Like we invest the majority of our time in our lives with employers. And so you need to make sure that they are aligned to the things that you want to do and vice versa. And then think about, well, how can you uniquely help them solve the problems that they're going after? Because there's many different people vying for those positions, and it's then what do you bring to the table that uniquely solves the problem for them?
Yeah, these are all amazing tips. I hope everyone's taking notes here, but of course we'll send the recording after so you can recap and remember all of the great things that Alastair has shared with us today. So now let's pop into the chat here, scroll through to see where we can get started. There have been many fun questions here. Give me a sec to filter out the chit chat.
All good.
All right. So let's see. I see a bit of messages about technical difficulties. Let's get down to the meat of it, the real questions. Is that it? Oh, here. Okay. We have a question from Pavneet who says, how does Dropbox find the right talent and where? So that's actually a great question I'm curious about too. Like, where do you find people? Do they come to you? Do you post on websites? Or how do you find your talent?
Well, generally, yes to those things. So yes, we'll post jobs. And yes, people will just naturally apply. We also sponsor events. Like I was at the Grace Hopper conference where we did some networking events with up and coming grads. So we have graduate programs and intern programs. We also look at there's a very tactical aspect of where can we hire people across the USA, because you have to have the right tax things in different states. But then we will look at different markets and where should we be looking to hire talent, more diverse talent across America. And so there is a number of different tactics that we'll work through with our recruitment partners, because as a hiring manager, that's what I'm looking to do, is partner with the recruitment team to make sure that we are giving ourselves the best opportunity to close a role as quickly as possible with the right talent in the right location to bring the right diversity to the team that we want.
Yeah, so do you see coming into the future, 2021 and beyond, do you see Dropbox possibly ever opening up to hiring globally, or is that not in the works for now?
We not for now. I mean, we already have an office in Tel Aviv. We have an office in Dublin, and so we obviously have a presence there. But as we announced, as we talked about, we've shifted to this virtual first way of working, and so people will be working from home predominantly. And so we are looking at how do we expand our footprint more globally. But for right now, the main centers that we have are in Ireland and Tel Aviv, Australia. Sorry, I should have mentioned Australia and Japan. As well as across North America.
So do you require people to be, as you're hiring now, new people who weren't just in that office from the start? Do you require people to be within the vicinity of your new Dropbox studios, as you call them now?
Sorry, what do you mean? Do we require them to be?
Say the closest Dropbox studio to me is a 3-hour flight. Like, do I need to actually live in the same city, or can I come like once every couple of months?
Yeah, got it. That's the intention with Dropbox Studios, is that you would come once a quarter, and we budgeted for that, for people to come to their Dropbox studio like once a quarter to collaborate with their team. So teams will come together for quarterly kickoffs or quarterly end of month retros and for team building. And so that's the intention. And so if you're 3 hours away, then we have budget for you to come like once a quarter to those Dropbox studios that's most local to you.
Nice. It seems like a great plan that you all have there. I'm really excited to hear more about it and how it continues into 2021.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, as I said, it was an incredibly thoughtful approach. And for us, we're trying to level the playing field for all of our employees. And there are different, and no knock on different approaches, but there's the hybrid approach where people are either in the office or remote. And that we just didn't feel that created the right level playing field for our employees. And so that's why we went with this virtual first approach with the studios.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really excited to hear about it. We have our next question from Cindy, who says, I was wondering if you have any advice for designers who are trying to get their first role remotely.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, it's my advice for designers who are trying to get their first role, probably period, not necessarily remotely, but is, again, we've talked about this, but it's how do you make sure that you're telling the right narrative about the experience that you do have? Because you will have experience if you've either just finished your college degree or whether you've done some internships. You will have relevant experience or worked on your own projects, right? Like you will have relevant experience. And then how do you make sure that your either online portfolio or your LinkedIn tells that story in a really cohesive way? And always when I'm looking at portfolios, I'm looking for, similar to the interview questions, it's like, did the person understand the problem that they were solving before they jumped to solutions? Did they have a clear goal and hypothesis in mind so they knew whether they were going to be successful? Then looking at the actual solution. Also, how did they bring a team along on that journey? Because you don't just design something on your own as a designer. You've got engineering and product and research and data scientists. So how did you bring that along? And so how can you make sure that you're telling that story in your portfolio via LinkedIn, whatever medium that you're using? And then if you're literally looking for your first job and you've only either got college experience or you don't have college experience, how can you show your own projects? I remember a designer I hired at Atlassian who he hadn't had any work experience, but he had gone and done internships. He had some really great personal projects that he'd worked through in a really human-centered way. And he was able to really tell a clear narrative of what he could bring to the company as a junior entry-level designer. And I know that he's still there and he's thriving. And so how do you make sure that you're, telling your story, telling a narrative in a really clear way?
Yeah, it sounds like when it comes down to it, it's all about storytelling, being able to express who you are in your journey, what you can do so far, what you've been doing for 20 years or 1 month, and just putting it into words.
Yeah.
Let's see. The next question from Maya. She says, thank you for your insights and time today. And she wants to know, in a remote workforce culture, how will Dropbox ensure staff are provided remote opportunities to network and seek mentorship? She says monthly meetups are a great start, but her concern is that less frequent in-person interactions inhibit those organic touch points like coffee chats and that allow for casual relationship building.
We're working on those things. So we had a meeting about that a couple of days ago because we're very cognizant that we need to make sure that we're making space for what we call those cross connections. We did some research where the thing that people miss in remote work settings is those accidental collisions or those cross connections. If you look at the way that great offices are designed, they're designed to have accidental collision spaces where people can accidentally bump into each other, whether that's in a hallway or in a coffee, like a restaurant kind of area, because those serendipitous interactions are important. And so we're meeting as a community and culture team at Dropbox, who we're very fortunate to have, who are looking at ways that we can facilitate that. And so I don't have all the answers right now, but it's very much top of mind. And we're looking at things like making sure we have regular mentoring programs, making sure that we have interactive, serendipitous ways for people to connect. And something that I do just as a design leader is my design org is about 170 people. So that's quite big. And how does designer in one team know what's going on in another at a scale like that? And we have a weekly design share out where the intent is not to do design critique because the team's too big, but it's just to try and create those serendipitous cross connections where designer A can say, oh, that's what you're working on over there. We're doing something similar. Let me connect with you. And so just being, again, intentional about your practices will help you like create those moments. Because again, like, well, just going back to like offices, just because you're in the same location, if you're not intentional about your culture or about how you create space for those moments, it doesn't mean that the office culture is any better, like if you're not intentional. And so I think that's the thing that you have to transition to remote is intentionality.
That's a great point. I think that it all comes back to that word today. It's our common, it's the remote vocab word of the day. Be intentional with everything you do. Yeah. Next question we have is from Ani. How do you find that ambition and the why? That's a tough question.
It is, but I think I've been fortunate. I've worked with some great executive coaches who run a few frameworks. And so I can give, I mean, this is not full detail, but start by looking back. What in your career were your highs and your lows? But then really prod into them as a good designer would and say, why? Why did that experience suck? Like why was that experience awesome, right? And I can guarantee it won't be, because I like The Office, right? It'll be something much richer than that if you really go and press on it. So look back and then look forward in 10 years and look out, like in 20 years. This is an exercise I've done with one of my coaches. In 20 years, what do I want people to remember me for? And this was that exercise where I mentioned the design director thing. It's like, I don't want people to remember me as a design director or as a VP of design. I want people to remember me for having a positive impact on their own career. And so look forward and be really, again, intellectually honest. Like, what are the things that motivate you? What do you care about? Like, how do you want to be remembered and how do you want to show up in the world? And then, look at, you should from that have a bunch of quite deep points and then try and figure out, well, what are the most important things for me in this moment in time? And if I want to be here in 20 years, what is the next step that I need to take in order to get there? And so, and that's super helpful. And that's how I, ultimately figured out that I wanted to work at mission and values driven companies, that I wanted to have an impact on people's careers. And also as well, I should add that you make mistakes as well, right? Like the job I had pre-Atlassian was great. I learned a lot, but I also learned that I didn't want to work in streaming media where I was just helping more people watch more TV. That was all I was doing. I wanted to have a bit more of an impact on the world than that. And so you make mistakes, but you need to learn from them.
Yeah, that's very true. I think we are starting to get low on time here, so I'm going to pick one last question. Sorry to those of you who we couldn't get to. I know we have many amazing questions here. I would like to ask you this one from Emiko, since this feels very relevant right now to these current times, I'm sure for a lot of people. How would you recommend balancing the immediate financial need versus pursuing a job at a place in which the company's missions align with your values?
Again, it's difficult to give a full answer to that because I don't know Emiko's true personal circumstance around the finances, right? It's like, but you obviously need to make sure that you have the base level, the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That you can look after yourself and that you can fund just get yourself basic shelter and you have enough money for shelter and food and to survive. You obviously need to make sure that you have that. But my general advice here is that as long as you can get that, is that in the long term, you'll be happier if you're working at a company that aligns to your own vision and values, even if it pays you less, right? Like when I transitioned into design, I took a more than 50% pay cut, like when I took my first design job. But ultimately, I was much happier in the long run. But as I said, I want to be empathetic to people's situations, that you need to make sure that you have that base level of human need around shelter and food, because that's very important. It's very real in today's terms. But certainly, I would try to advocate for working on things that align to your personal values and your personal mission that you're on.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. If you can make it through, if you have your basic needs, I think it sounds like you really care about mission of the company and you do advocate for someone waiting for the right fit. But
yeah,
sometimes life doesn't let you wait for the right thing at all times. But yeah, so I think we should wrap up now. But I'd like to ask you one final question. If you can think into the future of Dropbox, where do you see Dropbox going, and how do you see the company changing throughout 2021, 22, in the next coming years?
I think, as I said, we want to be thoughtful and intentional and make sure that we're creating a great work environment where our employees can really do great work in a virtual first environment, but then also share those practices about how we work externally with the world. I mentioned the Virtual First Toolkit, that's the first version of that, but then also create great products that support a distributed or a remote way of working. And so that's honestly what I hope for the future of Dropbox, is marrying that how we work with the what and the products that we're building to make a positive impact on, designing that enlightened way of working, which is our company mission.
That's great. I'm so excited to see where Dropbox goes in the future, and all of these companies, once we move past the kind of crisis mode that we're all in now. I'm just seeing how the world is changing and how these companies are adapting along with it. So thank you so much for joining us, Alastair, and thank you to our audience for tuning in here. Looks like that's it for today. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again shortly.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.